This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest got his undergrad in psychology and then received his MBA from Washington University in St. Louis. He's worked in a variety of industries from financial services to aerospace manufacturing and oil and gas at companies such as Edward Jones, Boeing, MasterCard, Citi, and NRG. He is also a consultant for the Volunteer Executive Council, where he consults with nonprofits on their business plans. Please welcome Director of Advanced Analytics at AmeriGas, Keith Aumiller. Welcome to the show, Keith.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
I want to get right into the meat and potatoes. What is one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
Well, I would say there's two that are kind of tied for me. One would be just general education around what is and is not possible. So, I'm not an oracle. I don't have magic. It's science. That's kind of how we answer questions, which means we don't know everything, but we do know how to find the best answer possible. So that's probably the number one thing. And number two, which is kind of cliche at this point, everybody kind of knows it, but trash in, trash out. Data quality is probably the king, right? You can have the best algorithms in the world, and if you don't have good data to base them off of, then you're not going to get good results. So I'd say the vast majority of the time, whenever I start in a new organization with a new group of people and new executives I have to educate, the biggest thing that comes up is the fact that they haven't really put together the infrastructure and the processes to ensure consistent quality of data. So timeliness, consistency, things like that. And there's a million metrics for data quality, but they're all pretty important.
One of the things that you just mentioned was having an understanding of what is possible versus what's not possible. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. Are you saying that there are things which are generally not possible or given in a given situation?
Both, right? But let's stick with the just generally not possible, right? And we can kind of talk about generative AI a little bit as an example, because it's like the latest, fashion trend in data science and AI and all of this. People are talking to these large language models and thinking they're like the voice of God or something. And the reality is that they are, they're word generation machines. They can only spit out what has already been spit before. And they're not going to provide any amazing new insights that you're not going to find from a human being. They're really just regurgitating what other experts have already printed out on the internet. So the trouble that we get into, I think, at the executive level is when they think they're going to get something out of the data or out of some sort of insight out of these models that was completely unavailable before. And rarely do you get some sort of like magic insight into your business or into your customers that from these things that wasn't there, right? So they, if you're having attrition problems or like churn problems, and you point a large language model at your data set for your customers' feedback, like you will get results, but they're going to be skewed towards the people who gave you feedback. They're not going to be anything that's not in the data. And more importantly, that they don't, oftentimes customers will report things or talk about things that bother them, but it's not really why they're canceling their service or whatever. So for example, several utility companies I've worked with, they'll kind of do a analysis of the customer data, and most of the customers complain about service, and they complain about, lack of on-time delivery or a lack of, responsiveness or things like this. But in reality, those things wouldn't even necessarily have upset them if they hadn't gotten a bill that was outrageous. But they're not going to mention the bill being outrageous. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, where the model can kind of give you some insight if you're completely oblivious to what's going on in your business, but it's not going to find those things necessarily that are not represented in the data.
I love using the example of generative AI to highlight some of the limitations of all of these tools that we use. Not just that one, right? Every tool has its own set of limitations.
Right.
I wonder if you can talk to me a little bit about how we can my brain wants to say better educate folks in this field, but I'm wondering if that is even kind of a disservice masquerading as a question, right? Like, is it our responsibility to teach all of our consumers and end users again, like the inner workings of an LLM so that they understand what types of problems it has? Yeah. So, like, how, what's the answer? How do we interface with people to get them to use these tools properly to get maximum effect?
Well, I would say it's buyer beware, right? Just like every other product. And because, large language models are like the hot new thing, everybody's got a million business cases for this thing about how it's going to improve customer service or it's going to improve insight into financial planning or whatnot. But the trick to like being a good consumer of this stuff is understanding, educating yourself, right? Because business people with products are going to sell what they have. It doesn't matter what you really need; they're going to sell what they're selling. And if you don't know what you're buying, you're gonna buy a bunch of stuff you probably don't need. So
Mm,
understanding like a large language model is good for generating content, like text content, is an important step. It's not good at doing forecasting or doing insight into large data sets of numbers and doing complicated logical connections. It doesn't do that kind of stuff. It is a, hey, if I give you a string of text, what is the most appropriate response back? And as long as you simplify it to that level and your understanding of it, um, that then it makes you a much more educated user. You don't need to understand how large language model works. You don't need to understand, the ins and outs of, back propagation and transformers and all these things. You just need to understand that it's a very like hyped up, uh, chatbot. Now that being said, those things, they have, the entirety of human knowledge at their fingertips, and it'll give you the base level. If you search the internet, what would an expert say about this topic response, right? But if you ask it about something specific in a specific genre or a specific specialty that's not got very good published information about it, you're going to still get a response back. And it's going to be the kind of response you get from like a smart guy who knows a little bit about everything, but doesn't necessarily know about that specific thing. So he'll make things up. And that's what I keep on trying to explain to, my peers that are trying to, purchase these products is you need to understand that in the absence of actual knowledge, it will just start talking and spitting things out to you. And you gotta be very careful with your use cases and make sure you have your own metrics of what you think are appropriate answers for that kind of product. So you have your base level, and then the rest of it should all be fun. Now, that being said, those things are still smarter than your average person, right? Like if you were to jump on a chat GPT and ask it, about medical stuff, it's probably going to give you a better answer than me, right? I wouldn't ask it to solve complex logic problems, and I wouldn't ask it about your personal life, right? Because it's not going to know about any of those things.
yeah, when I think about generative AI, I think one of the things that I like to be really clear on and that I like to ensure that folks know about is what is it that's actually getting generated? So, in the case of something like ChatGPT, it is text that's getting generated, not ideas.
Right.
And I think that that's really the balance is I think the place that folks like you and I fit in is okay, we know that there is X business problem. Cool. Well, I try to do a good job of, being me and keeping up to date on like what all the things in my space are. Well, what is that business problem? Does that business problem involve generating text? Okay, well then this is a tool that we can use. If the business problem that we have involves something else, well then maybe this is not the right solution. So it's just Kind of as you mentioned, this is just one of a set of tools that we have that, given a particular business problem, there may be some subset that we can use to try and approach and solve that problem. But putting square pegs in round holes is a recipe for wasting lots of money.
Yeah, and that's a pretty consistent part of the education process is educating the people who would leverage a guy like me on all the different kinds of statistical tools that are available, right? So I kind of equate it to being a plumber. It's
Mm.
like you got some plumbers that, all they show up with is a wrench, right? And they're good for one type of problem. And then you got guys that are really well educated that have a million tools in their tool belt, and they've got stuff on the truck that they can pull in. And it still doesn't help if the guy who hired the plumber doesn't know where the sink is at. Do you know what I mean? So there's a certain amount of like helping them understand the tools that you have available to you, but also showing them within their business where those tools can even be used. Right. And that's kind of like what you were saying with the large language models is like this generate text. And do I have a business problem for generating text? I think what's going on right now with a lot of these startups and a lot of these businesses is they're trying to teach the businesses where these tools fit into their business, right? So everybody's got this large language model wrench, and they're trying to convince all the different businesses that where their sink is at. So for large language models, it seems to be customer service seems to be like the biggest gold rush, and then sales and lead generation, automated calling, a lot of that kind of stuff. But for me, that's just like one tool in my toolbox that I get to deal with, right? And that one is so automated and such a like off the shelf solution that you don't even need a guy like me if you're going to do a large language model solution anymore. I'll just show you how to do an integration project and plug you into, Gemini or ChatGPT or one of these other solutions that are out there. I'm not going to build that for anyone. Um, so yeah, it's a complicated conversation to have with executives that are maybe trained in marketing or they're trained in operations, but they don't know statistics or statistical model development process.
I was actually just going to take us in that direction. So outside of kind of the generative AI buzzy stuff, talk to me about the other areas of advanced analytics and what those areas can do to help folks.
Yeah. So, these are all tools that kind of build on top of themselves, right? So a lot of what I get engaged on is for forecasting, trying to predict the future and figure out, how much sales are there going to be? What is going to be the attrition rate on customers? That's a big thing is doing forecasting. And there's a lot of different methodologies for that. Um, Way more than like large language models alone. But you kind of start with a baseline of figuring out where people are at, and then you plug in some other AI type models like Profit, which is Meta's open source, you know, Python library for doing forecasting, or you pick some other methodology depending on the type of data that you're dealing with. But forecasting is a big part of it. Yeah.
Mm.
And then just automation in general. The algorithms themselves are so advanced now, and we have basically equivalents to any sort of thought process that people are going to do. So you can, if you get a good process flow on any business, there's nothing that's not automatable at this point. We have driving cars, we have um, computer vision to do analysis. We have interpretation of that to classify auto classifiers that then can just put things into good and bad categories or even more. So, when you start building this suite of like statistical tools all up together, what you get is something that is a suite that you can basically take any process flow and automate end to end. And then the question could becomes less about whether or not you can do it, because the answer is always yes, you can do it. Question is, does the business case make any sense? And should you bother doing it? Right.
I like how you broke two really large categories of value that analytics and kind of the people that do analytics can generate. Because when I think of analytics, forecasting neatly falls into that. But I think
Right.
you're absolutely right to call out automation. Um, which many times is not thought of as an analytics or BI or data responsibility. But the amount of time that I spend trying to automate things is a huge percentage of the time. And I think there are two pieces to this puzzle. One is our world straddles the business and the technical. So we're kind of uniquely positioned to understand business processes and apply technical solutions to them.
Right.
I think the other thing, and maybe this is my internal bias for my field showing through here, but outside of the actual manufacture of goods, it strikes me that a huge percentage of business processes are really about the entry, cleaning, flowing, approving, processing of data.
Oh, a large portion. Yeah. Anything that's going to be like out of the home off white collar jobs, basically white collar jobs. And that's the thing that everybody's talking about right now is the fact that historically, automation has been geared towards the manufacturer and the physical labor and making, looming is more efficient now. So now we got to destroy all the looms. It's going to put all the loom people, the weavers out of business. And, economically, there was, big concern about all that back in the day and automation, industrialization and all that. And now the white collar jobs were always kind of safe from that, right?
Yeah.
Because there was no way to automate a brain or a decision-making process prior. And in the last, 20, 30 years, it's really picked up and it started out in, way back in the day with expert systems of like, automated call center phones, like press one for whatever. And that nobody thinks that that kind of stuff is artificial intelligence, but it really is. You're automating an operator, that would normally do that routing. You've created an automated system to do that. And there's an information gathering component and then a processing and then a routing, just like you were talking about. And I think what's concerning to people now is that automation has reached a level, then literally everything is automated. So up to the CEO of a company and everything below it is automated. The questions of like staffing levels, capacity planning for different positions, forecasting sales, heck, even the sales process, like we were talking about earlier with the large language models, is getting automated. Automated phone calls out to prospects. So there's really not anything that's off the table. I think the stuff that is really safe from my position would be the people who have ideas and identify areas of improvement that don't exist at all. Once there's a process flow in place, you get guys like me and we come in and we'll break it down to the data point level and figure out what exactly is needed in order to make a decision. And also whether or not it can even be made with data. Like sometimes you don't even have enough data to make a decision. So yeah, it's all automation. My perspective. When a lot of analytics guys like they go, we build reports and we build dashboards. And I don't think of it that way. Those dashboards are just intermediary data sets that the decision hasn't been automated on it yet, right? They're analysis dashboards so that some guy can do an analysis and then make a decision or generate some sort of, output. But the next step after the dashboard is who's using the dashboard and what's the decision they're making and what direction are they going to go in with that? So yeah, it's all automation in my mind. It's not just dashboards and analytics.
Mm. I want to change direction. You've spent considerable time in both the finance and energy sectors, among others.
Right.
I'm curious to know, using those two as, really big fields. People are familiar with these, right? Like everybody to some degree is using both of these.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about lessons you've learned in those industries that were unique to those industries that you think are applicable outside of them.
Well, the first would probably be data quality. So every industry has different standards for data quality. And I think people would be somewhat shocked as far as what the rankings are from a quality standpoint when working with data. I think I think people assume, so I'll just start at the top. The best, cleanest data I've ever worked with, financial services, without a doubt. Like accounting systems, you cannot have a decimal out of place. If you're missing 1 cent, that means there's a leak in your process, which means you're losing money somewhere or somebody's siphoning it off. So there is zero tolerance for low quality analysis and data when it comes to financial transaction systems, specifically the transaction systems. So
Mhm.
they're top of the line. There's a million monitors in place. There's a million people in place to kind of follow up and track down that 3 cents that went missing. And that they're just the head and shoulders, and we're talking about billions and trillions of dollars at play. So it makes sense, right?
Mhm.
You mess with people's money, a lot of eyes are gonna get focused on it. So
Mhm.
that's a pretty big lesson learned. And those controls that you learn working in data and working in finance, when you go to other industries, are very, very valuable, but also makes you a little bit of a snob, honestly, an energy company or something like that. Because
Mhm.
you get over there, and and this is probably a little bit shocking for some people, and I can say this because I'm not in pharma right now. But the reality is pharmaceutical data is the worst. It's the worst data that I've ever dealt with. From all the, I mean, manufacturing plant data is better than what you get in pharma, and it's mostly a result of how the data is gathered and input in the system. In pharmaceuticals, you got little old ladies typing on iPads to enter in whatever symptoms they see on a patient or in a study. And so there's a lot of room for error or misinterpretation or things like that. So um, when you go from financial services to pharma, your initial reaction is shut it down. Like, we should not be using this data. This is not the kind of thing that you should be basing the decisions on whether or not to ship a vaccine, right?
Mhm.
Um, the quality is just not there. They rely very heavily on statistical analysis and generalization and data cleaning and follow up, but it never quite reaches the same level of quality as like a bank. The other thing too is pharmaceutical studies are constantly, there's no standardization with pharmaceutical studies. They're a little different every time, so it's hard to get good quality data processes in that space. So that's a pretty big lesson learned is that don't assume that the way you did it, the way you in your last company is the way the next company is gonna even need it. The standards are different, right? The expectations are different, the standards are different. And so things that would never fly in banking, they're perfectly acceptable. I wanted to put things in place when I first started in pharma, to kind of like stop and slow things down, and the reality is you can't, because the business itself would collapse and not make enough money to justify its existence if you put a stop to everything that made you uncomfortable. So you kind of have to just roll with it and try to adjust and improve things on the fly. Um, in financial services, if something goes wrong, you shut it down. Like if you think something's iffy or if some system's compromised or some analysis is off, you just don't move forward with it and you shut it down. In pharmaceuticals, you keep on moving forward and you collect more data until you reach a definitive conclusion. So it's a different strategy and it's a different methodology, and the quality for the systems is different. So at Citigroup, things would be redundant, 3 servers that all did the same thing with a load balancer and blah, blah, blah. And then pharmaceuticals would be like 1 server that sometimes goes down on the weekends, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the standards are completely different depending on where you're at.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think is an interesting follow-up conversation to that is, as data people, I look at one and I'm like, "Ooh, redundant servers and perfectly accurate," like that seems
Right,
objectively better.
right,
However, when I take off my tech nerd hat and I put on my business consultant hat, telling the company that is totally sufficiently running effectively without that infrastructure, and telling them that they need to, number one, like, stop their processes, spend a bunch of money, like having other businesses run at that kind of cost and effort profile would be bad advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you're in a bank, doubling your IT costs so that you can add, a 0.01% availability uptime increase makes sense because you're processing millions of dollars. You're making, hundreds of thousands of dollars off of this stuff, if not millions. And so doubling your IT costs in order to ensure that extra 2 hours a year that the system is available or whatever, um, business cases there, and it makes sense. But when, you're talking about in pharma, like who is going to the doctor on a Saturday night anyways, right? So you don't necessarily need the same coverage that you would need like in a financial services institution. And the margins are not necessarily there for like a data collections organization and in pharma that, there's just not a monetary incentive to do that. So they cut corners and they skimp on some things that, a bank would consider mandatory, but they're like, we'll get it tomorrow.
As I think back to like what we originally started the conversation with, which is, all of these things, whether it's hardware, software, whatever type of, either one of those it is a tool in a business's belt
Right.
to solve problems and achieve their goals, right? And for most businesses, that's, profit or growth or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, Overspending on things that are not helping you achieve those goals is, so it really does, I think, all roads for now still point back to what are the business's objectives? What are the tools that are available? What are the use cases for those particular tools? How can we implement them effectively and efficiently? Right. Crazy, but like I guess it all just comes back to Biz 101.
Yeah. I mean, funny thing about all this new AI stuff is that, it's like people have forgotten business fundamentals, which is like, what's the business case? What's your investment potential? What's the potential for return on that investment? How long is it going to take to get done? What is the long-term commitment required out of something like this? And I think the way a lot of it's being sold right now is that like, oh, you pay up front and build it and they will come kind of attitude. And they're skipping all of these like entry level fundamental business case kind of analysis type things. I've seen at least half a dozen like AI related projects fail over the last 4 years. And every single one of them boiled down to not getting a solid baseline and a solid business case of what are our clear objectives of what we're trying to accomplish and how are we going to measure it and how much are we going to invest and how much do we expect the return to be. I see the returns expectations be completely wildly outrageous. And I see the investment be incredibly low for what it is. And those things never quite meet up in the middle on these failed business projects. Um, and oftentimes you don't even need a data scientist or an AI expert or anything to implement a lot of these things. If they were just run like standard IT projects, they would have not run afoul of these things. But I think, the buzzwords and people see dollar signs and they're afraid of missing out on this gold rush of AI. But this dirty secret is that it's not really a gold rush. This stuff has been around for quite a while.
Mm.
It's just that it was so risky. Most people wouldn't do it. Like, did you ever hear the story of Tay, the Microsoft chatbot that was left in training mode on Twitter?
I haven't. Please tell me.
And so Tay, and you can Google it. It's on Wikipedia and stuff too. It's a fascinating case study in just AI gone completely wrong for a big corporation. So Microsoft had an intern develop this AI chatbot, which was called Tay, which was supposed to simulate a teenage girl, and they put her on Twitter, right? And what ended up happening is they made the mistake of leaving her in training mode, right? So they didn't create a model and leave it in a fixed state for responding. What they did is they would incorporate new feedback from users into the training data set and then retrain it every hour or
I think I
whatever.
see where this is going.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know where it's going. Within a couple days, the thing was a Nazi, sexaholic, inappropriate, would say anything to get a rise out of anybody troll. And it took less than, 48 hours for this thing to go completely off the rails. They set it up on Friday. By Monday morning, it was like a national news story of how terrible this thing was and how
Yeah.
horrific the output was. And it was like, an early chatbot. It wasn't a large language model, but it was a transformer based model. And it's just a perfect example of like productionize your models. Do not release things that take live data into your training data sets. It's just, I love bringing that one up because every single time people are like, "Oh, can we implement this?" And, how often we're going to incorporate the new data? And it's like, well, let's slow down here and make sure we have our clear goals and objectives of this thing set. Because if you have an unclear goal like engagement, which is what Tay's objective was, and you allow user input and constantly training, what you're going to get is a broken model very
Mm.
quickly. And it's not just true of chatbots or large language models; it's true of any sort of machine learning, automated training model system.
Well, I was actually just going to make the point that it seems that it's true for humans as well,
Oh yeah,
right?
well,
Like they may have been simulating human behavior a little bit more effectively if we take a real look at social media, because there's plenty of those people out there that are, saying and doing those things. In fact, I'd say it's even, outside of social media, right? Like there have been people saying controversial things to accumulate eyeballs, I think, as long as there's been soapboxes in the world for people to stand on.
right. And it's like a race to the bottom. Who can be the most horrific and outrageous?
Yeah. One thing that I'm interested to ask, we've spent a good portion of today talking about what I would categorize as more advanced analytics and, computing technologies.
Yeah.
What is the place for doing simple well? What is the place for simple, accurate, descriptive analytics?
Yeah, no, so that lives at the team level, in my opinion. Like descriptive analytics. Like if you're running a team, like a smaller organization, you need clear KPIs that are measured consistently and reported consistently. So whatever your department primary objective and your mission statement is, that's where those descriptive analytics kind of live. If you want to see, well, look in the past, like what has been happening. Those are good descriptive analytics. Um, when when you start getting away from that is when you want to know like what's going on in the future, or you get a complex system where you're trying to analyze customer churn, right? That's a complex system of like people leave services for a lot of different reasons, and so you need a much more complicated analysis than just like a descriptive an analytics. And automation is advanced. Anything that gets into automation kind of gets out of the descriptive or the baseline analytic stuff. Um, Power BI, Click, Tableau, all of those are analyst tools, in my opinion. They're really good for people who work on a very specific business problem. And frankly, a guy like me hasn't gotten to them yet. Right. So my job is to figure out what the analysts are doing, automate it, and put an automation system in place. But until then, that's where those tools kind of live, is in this space of we know something about what needs to be done. We know how to measure it, but we haven't figured out how to automate it yet. That's where those things kind of live in my
Mm.
mind. Now, from my perspective, that's the first thing I do when I'm coming into an automation project is show me what your analysts are doing. What are their reports that they generate every week or every month or whatever, and who's getting them, and what are the decisions that those people are making? What are your inputs? What are your outputs? What are your algorithms and your decision making processes in between? And oftentimes that middle part where they don't know what their decision making process is, that's where those dashboards live. And you get me in there, and then I start asking questions of like, okay, well, how did you know to turn left instead of turn right? Well, this report said that we had 15 over here and 12 over there, so I went to the left. It's like, okay, well, that's a pretty simple algorithm. You go which side has the most, right? Sometimes it gets into a fuzzy area where there's like 15 different variables and they're trying to balance like capacity planning with, you know, supply and demand and like all these other things. And it ends up being a fuzzy math problem where there's no right answer. There's no right and wrong answer. In retrospect, the right and wrong answer, but you have incomplete data to make the decision. And so you have an analyst make the decision instead. So that's where I come in. I automate those fuzzy decision-making processes.
I have to admit, I don't know that I had ever thought of reporting as a break in automation.
It absolutely is.
Yeah, I would argue that it makes the assumption that everything can and should be automated, which I don't actually know which side of the fence of that I'm on, and I mean that actually, that's not like an "I don't know" that means I don't wanna say it, like, I don't actually.
Philosophical debate right now, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you do with all these people that get automated?
Well, so that at least, foolhardy and academic as it may be, right? Like economic theory tells us that like new markets and services will be created and that is a self-solving problem, right? And there will be, unfortunate consequences and periods of transition and cost and things like that, but that like over the long term, it increases drastically the quality of living for people. So the thing that interests me is let me put this question to you. If everything can and should be automated, then in theory, an entire organization can be automated.
Yep.
What does that mean for the future of business? Is it just like I have a really good idea and I like build this, intelligent, automated organization that does everything and I walk off into the sunset with money and then, take that to its extreme? What is it? It's just like the people that have ideas are obscenely wealthy and the rest of society crumbles or where does this go?
Well, I always come back to the old Warren Buffett quote when this kind of thing comes up, which is like, we can't all just sell pizzas to each other. It was in response to like pizzas were, stores were like, the big thing back in the 80s and like their most profitable business you could get into. And like people were like, why aren't you investing in this? And that was his response. And I think AI kind of falls into that same category. Like there will be an happy medium where we can build the mind clearing robot, but like it's way cheaper to pay people to do it. It just won't make any sense to automate certain things because the costs benefit analysis just won't be there. Now, what the scary thing about large language models that somebody pointed out to me and some of these AI systems is that they give access to intelligence to people who have money. So you don't need intelligence. Like that's been kind of like a thing is you may not be wealthy, but at least you're smart. And so you can earn a living and you can become wealthy because you're intelligent. Rich people don't need smart people anymore, I'm not sure what happens. Does that make sense? They can just ask their computer you know, whatever complicated problem they have. What is the end state of everything being automated in?
Mm.
We're all social media influencer trying to like get a buck off of each other, I
Yes.
guess. I just don't know. I really can't answer that question.
Which brings us back a world of Tays.
Yeah, world of taste, right?
Yikes.
I think that we're in a weird situation here, and from my perspective, it's kind of like get on the trade or get run over by it, kind of situation. Um, Long term, you get into some real weird philosophical spaces. Like, does it turn out like Star Trek, where it's like we don't have any other purpose than there's free money, there's free food, there's free entertainment, there's free everything except for boredom. So you explore the universe, right? Or does it end up like the Terminator, where it's like we just have a giant machine that we're all working for, you know, doing what? I don't know. But yeah, it could go a lot of different directions right now. But what I do know is that, it's not going to stop. There is definitely limits though. Like there's not going to be entropy is a real thing and energy transference is a real thing, right? Like
Yeah.
humans are much better at conserving energy than computers are, right? And it makes more sense to send a human being into an unknown situation than a robot because you can't build a robot to deal with every single situation. But humans are so adaptable, they could figure things out and come back and report and you know what I mean? So there's definitely things that, from like an energy and, you know, energy conservation perspective, humans are better at than machines. The other thing is Terminator. I love the Terminator conversations too, because it's like you realize in order for that to happen, every single component for every single computer would have to be 100% automated from, mining it from the earth to refining it to manufacturing the components to combining the component. Like there's human beings involved in every step of every single one of these things right now. So there's no apocalypse coming. People are freaking out over nothing.
Wait, so I should or should not invest in EMPs?
But I think you're better served investing in a homestead where you can grow your own food. But
Yeah, yeah.
peas, not so much.
So on that happy note,
I love the philosophical stuff. I could talk about that for hours.
we got to learn quite a bit from you. I want to learn a little bit about you and get the opportunity to share that with the listeners. When you're not thinking about this stuff or, helping people do it, what do you spend your time doing?
So I run a giant forum on Facebook for AI and data scientists. Deep learning net, I think it's called. But I'm on LinkedIn. People can hit me up there whenever they want. They have questions or concerns, or they want to just talk. Like I said, I love talking about this stuff. It's not just my job; it's my hobby. It's just fun for me. Outside of work, I do have my own consulting company as well. Like I do ad hoc consulting here and there. But friends and family. I used to be a jujitsu guy. I don't do jujitsu too much. I'm too old. I watch a lot of sci-fi, if that wasn't evident.
Clear from the Star Trek reference. Yeah.
Right, right. I do. I write some stories too, some terrible, ridiculous short stories. So
I don't know if they'd be terrible. I at least based on the conversations, I assume that you'd be exploring some cool content. So I would love to check that out. Keith, it was clear from talking to you that you've spent a lot of time not just, doing this stuff, but thinking about what the future looks like here. And so a lot of your ideas were very thought provoking to me as someone who kind of also lives in this field. So I know I hugely enjoyed getting my mind challenged and expanded a little bit today, and I can only assume the listeners did as well. So thank you for all the time that you put in and sharing some of it with us today.
yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me on. And if you ever want to, talk some more, feel free to hit me up. Because like I said, anybody that'll listen, I'll talk.
Also, for the audience, if you guys made it this far, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode today, please make sure to tell a friend, throw us a like or a subscribe or a good rating. It really helps to get the word out and keep the podcast growing. So thanks again for listening. Keith, thank you again for coming on. And this has been another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Have a good one. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.